I didn't cry when I found out my brother forged my name on our father's will. I didn't scream, or throw anything, or collapse into one of those dramatic heartbreaks you see in movies. I just stood there in the lawyer's office, my hands folded in my lap, as the air turned cold around me. I'm Lauren. I'm 33. And betrayal doesn't shock me anymore. Not when it comes from family. But this was something else. My brother Jacob wasn't always like this. We used to ride our bikes through the pecan groves behind our childhood home, dusty and laughing, swearing we'd never lie to each other the way adults always seem to do. But the day our father died, something in Jacob changed. Or maybe it didn't change at all. Maybe it just stopped pretending. The will was supposed to be straightforward. My father had been meticulous. A man of habit and principle, who kept records in fireproof lockboxes and labeled every file in his own sharp handwriting. He'd been sick for months before the end, and he'd told me, on a rare quiet afternoon, when the morphine hadn't dulled him completely, that he had everything arranged. "You'll be fine, Lore," he said, staring out the window. I made sure. But when the attorney opened the envelope and read aloud, I wasn't mentioned. Not once. Not by name. Not by title. It was as if I never existed. Jacob blinked innocently beside me. Too innocently. I waited for him to glance over and admit the mistake, but he didn't even flinch. The signatures were there, the document notarized. The house, the land, the investments, everything had been left to him. He even wore one of Dad's old watches that day. The gold one. The one Dad said he was keeping for me until I turned 35. The lawyer, Mr. Penrose, looked as confused as I felt. He remembered me from when he drafted the original version just 3 years ago. He coughed and fidgeted with his pen. "There was an updated will," he said, avoiding my eyes. I didn't argue. Not then. Instead, I walked to my car, drove 3 blocks away, and sat there for over an hour in a parked vehicle I'd nearly paid off with my own careful, honest money. I stared at nothing. Just the rhythm of the windshield wipers on a clear, dry day. That was 6 weeks ago. And I haven't spoken a word to Jacob since. Not directly. Not yet. But I've spoken to the bank. The county clerk. 2 notaries. And a friend of mine who works in document forensics. And I'm waiting, very, very patiently, for the right moment to speak again. Because if Jacob thought erasing me from the will would be the end of the story, he hasn't been paying attention. He's forgotten who I am. And that's about to be his biggest mistake. I haven't told anyone yet what I found behind the false wall in Dad's study. Not even my partner, and certainly not my mother, who still refers to Jacob as the only one who stayed. But I will. Soon. And when I do, this whole illusion Jacob built, the signatures, the lies, the version of himself he parades around in public, it's going to unravel. Completely. Because some stories are worth burning everything down for. And I've always been better at endings than he is. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, loved deep enough, and stayed honest, it would matter. It doesn't. Not to people who mistake kindness for weakness. I think my father understood that near the end. He never said it directly, but it was there, in the long silences between words, in the way his hand would tighten around mine when my mother left the hospital room. In how he always waited for her footsteps to fade before whispering anything real. Dad had been a steady man. Stoic to the point of discomfort. Not warm, not especially expressive, but loyal in ways that mattered. He paid bills early. Fixed fences in the rain. Drove me to school in the truck even when his joints flared. He never told me he loved me more than twice in my life, but he remembered every allergy I ever had, and made pancakes every birthday without fail. He believed in fairness, which is why what happened still feels so deeply wrong. Growing up, Jacob had always been louder. Hungrier. The one who took the last piece of cake and argued why it was fair. I was quieter. I memorized things. I learned to step aside. I thought patience was a virtue, that being good would be noticed eventually. It wasn't. I remember one winter, I must have been 9 or 10, when Jacob stole $50 from Dad's wallet. Mom found it missing first, her voice sharp from the kitchen. I sat frozen at the table, instinctively trying to disappear. Jacob came in 10 minutes later, face calm, holding the cash in his palm. He said, "I found it in Lauren's room." Dad didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He just stared at me for a long time, quietly, tiredly, and said, "We'll talk about this later." He never did. I cried into my pillow that night, not because of the punishment, which never came, but because it was easier for everyone to believe Jacob. That was the beginning of a slow, lifelong understanding. In our family, noise outweighed truth. When I was 14, I started working weekends at McKinley's, the hardware store in town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real work, restocking shelves, memorizing product codes, learning which paint brands dried faster in humidity. Dad was quietly proud. He'd pick me up in the evenings, nodding without a word when I told him what I learned. Sometimes he'd test me, pretending not to remember a measurement or code, just to see if I did. He never said I was smart. But he trusted me to be. College wasn't expected of me. Not the way it was for Jacob. He flunked out after 2 years of partying, burning through our grandparents' savings with nothing to show for it. I went to the local state school instead, commuted from home, worked 2 jobs, and still finished in 3.5 years. At graduation, Mom brought Jacob. He wore my father's old tie and made loud jokes through the ceremony. Dad came late. Sat in the back. Didn't bring flowers or a card. Just a pat on the shoulder afterward and the words, "I saw your name in the program." That was enough for me, back then. Or I told myself it was. Years later, when Dad's health started to fail, it was me who kept track of the doctor visits. Me who filled the pill organizers, who sorted the insurance statements, who sat through the slow, grinding conversations with specialists while Jacob updated his social media about family time. He'd swoop in once every few weeks, cheerful, loud, making a show of bringing Dad his favorite soda. Mom would beam. And when he left, I'd be the one taking the blood pressure, wiping the spilled drink, arranging the next appointment. Dad began talking more toward the end. It was as if some veil had lifted, like he'd started measuring what time he had left and realizing how much of it had been wasted on silence. He asked about my work. About the apartment I'd saved 5 years to buy. About the loan I co-signed for Jacob that he never repaid. He said, "I wasn't blind, you know." I didn't know how to answer that. I think he felt guilty. Not just for Jacob, but for all the years he let things pass. For being a man who followed routines instead of feelings. For never saying out loud what needed to be said. One night, he called me into his study. The room had always smelled like dust and wood polish and something faintly metallic. I stood by the door, unsure. He pointed to the bookshelf. He said, "Third shelf." The gray folder. Inside was a typed letter. A draft, and signed, with bullet points beneath my name. Account numbers. Property titles. Passwords. A note in his handwriting that said, "Final version with Penrose." That's when I knew. He'd left everything to me. Not out of favoritism. But because he knew I'd protect it. Not spend it. Not trade it for approval. Because I'd earned it, not just with blood, but with character. I didn't tell Jacob. Or Mom. Or anyone. But I made copies. That folder is still in my closet. Sealed in a fireproof pouch beneath my old winter coats. I've read it a dozen times. Not because I needed the information, but because the letter is the only time my father ever said, in writing, what I always wanted to hear. That I mattered. That I was trusted. So when Jacob's name appeared on that final version of the will, when Penrose read it aloud without blinking, it wasn't grief that hit me. It was insult. Because it wasn't just theft. It was erasure. And no one erases me without a fight. I think what hurts most isn't the money. It's the rewriting of reality. The smug look on Jacob's face, like he knows I won't do anything. Like he still thinks I'm the quiet girl who lets the lie stand because arguing only makes things worse. But that girl is gone now. I've been collecting documents. Pulling credit reports. Comparing signatures. Reviewing witness affidavits. And last week, in a long-forgotten safety deposit box, I found something Jacob didn't know existed. A handwritten codicil. Undated. And signed, but undeniably Dad's writing. The language is raw. Personal. Not legally binding, maybe. But powerful. He wrote. Jacob will resent this. But Lauren is the one who stayed. The one who understood. My fingers trembled as I held the page, the ink faded, the paper slightly curled at the edges. It wasn't a weapon. Not yet. But it could be. If I play this right, it will be the first domino. And Jacob's whole version of the truth will come crashing down with it. All I need now is one more document. And I know exactly where to find it. Some betrayals don't come as knives in the back. They arrive as soft voices, familiar smiles, and sentences that start with "I'm just trying to help." I didn't go to the house for a confrontation. Not that day. I went because the original copy of the will, the real one, had to be somewhere. Dad never threw anything away. He kept receipts from 20 years ago, warranties for appliances that no longer existed. If Penrose's version had been switched, it hadn't started at the law office. It started at home. The house had been quiet since the funeral. Mom stayed there most nights, still claiming grief despite how briskly she'd moved on from Dad's belongings. She'd boxed up his clothes within the first week. The living room photos were rearranged. The chair he always sat in was gone. It smelled like him, she said on the phone once. I couldn't take it. I didn't reply. When I pulled into the driveway that afternoon, her car was out front, but the windows were dark. Curtains drawn. The porch light was on despite the hour. It felt wrong, even before I stepped inside. I still had a key. I walked through each room slowly, like visiting a museum version of my childhood. The kitchen had new tile, Jacob's suggestion, I remembered. The pantry smelled like cinnamon and bleach. Upstairs, the office door was locked. It had never been locked before. I didn't knock. Instead, I walked to the guest room where Dad used to keep the portable filing boxes. And there, tucked behind a stack of old tax folders, I found a brown accordion file marked simply, Estate, Backup Copy. It wasn't what I hoped. No full will. But it included a scanned PDF of the original draft. The one Dad and Penrose had reviewed together 2 years ago. The one with my name listed as executor. As sole beneficiary. And it was signed. The problem? The printed date didn't match what Penrose read aloud 2 weeks ago. This version was from 8 months ago. Jacob's was dated 4 months later. I stared at the paper until the numbers blurred. Either Dad changed his mind, or someone else changed the file. I heard footsteps in the hall before I had time to move. Mom stood in the doorway. No surprise on her face. Just fatigue. Calculation. She said, "What are you looking for, Lauren?" I straightened. I replied, "The truth." Her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Not quite a threat. She said, "That's dangerous in this family." She didn't ask what I'd found. Didn't demand it back. She just stood there, letting the silence do the work. And I realized then that she knew. Not just about the will, but about Jacob. About what he'd done. Maybe she hadn't forged it herself, but she'd let it happen. Maybe even encouraged it. The way she always had. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, every light off but one, rereading Dad's draft over and over. The wording was careful. Specific. Lauren has demonstrated sound judgment and integrity in both personal and financial matters. It wasn't flowery. It was precise. It was Dad. But it wouldn't be enough. I needed proof that the second version, the one Jacob submitted, wasn't Dad's. That the signature on it wasn't authentic. That the notary had been manipulated, or forged, or replaced. So I called Grace. She'd been my college roommate, now a paralegal with experience in document authentication. I didn't tell her everything. Just enough. I said, I need you to look at something. Quietly. Grace agreed without questions. She always had an instinct for when not to press. I emailed her scans that night. High-res photos of both will versions. Signatures. Dates. Margins. She called the next morning, early. She said, something's off. The signature on Jacob's version looked right, but the pressure points were inconsistent. The slant too mechanical. Grace ran it through software she used for contract disputes. The results came back inconclusive, but flagged it for further review. She said, I'd bet money it's traced. I exhaled slowly. The pieces were coming together. But I still needed one more. The notary. On the second version, the notary's name was a woman I'd never heard of, Shelley Durand. I searched her name and found a license number tied to a local mobile notary service. I called pretending to need assistance with an estate issue. When she answered, her voice was polite, neutral. I said, you notarized a will for Harold Green earlier this year. A pause. She said, I'm sorry, I don't recall the name. I said, April 17th. For Jacob Green. Another pause. Longer. She said, I've notarized thousands of documents. I'd need to check the log. She didn't call back. But her silence said more than a denial. By the end of the week, the pressure began to mount. Mom called twice. Left vague voicemails about keeping the family together and not making this harder than it needs to be. Jacob texted once. He said, let it go, Lore. It's what he wanted. You're only hurting yourself. I didn't respond. But my chest tightened with every word. The way he used Dad's name like a shield. The way he always had, repurposing sincerity as leverage. It was exactly what he'd done when we were kids. When he lied and watched me take the fall with that same blank smile. It wasn't just manipulation. It was memory. And the worst part was how easily the rest of them believed him. Or pretended to. Aunt Marla called to say she was so sorry about the confusion and that maybe you and Jacob could split things, for peace. As if this were a misunderstanding. As if fairness could be carved in half. Even Penrose had started avoiding my calls. His assistant said he was reviewing some case files, but I knew what that meant. He was distancing himself. No one wants to admit they missed a forgery. Especially not a man who's been the family attorney for 3 decades. So I sent a certified letter. To Penrose. To the notary board. To Jacob. With copies of the draft. A summary of inconsistencies. And a polite, legal-sounding statement that I intended to contest the will's validity. The response came 3 days later. A formal notice from Jacob's lawyer. A cease and desist. Claiming I was harassing the family. That I was emotionally unstable. That I'd been estranged from Dad for years, and this was a disruptive attempt to interfere with lawful inheritance. He was laying the groundwork. Painting me as fragile. Unreliable. And he was good at it. The weight of isolation set in slowly, like water seeping through a ceiling, quiet but constant. Friends I'd known since childhood began sending cautious texts. A coworker asked if everything was okay at home. Jacob was reshaping the narrative before I could speak. I understood then that I couldn't win this with facts alone. I needed something undeniable. Something he couldn't spin. And I had one place left to look. Dad's old storage unit. He rented it in town, 20 years ago, and never let anyone else access it. He claimed it was for tools. Old paperwork. Backups, he used to say. I hadn't been there in years. I barely remembered the location. But after 2 hours of digging through his bank records and autopay statements, I found the address. Unit 214. Tomorrow, I'll go. And if what I think is there. Jacob won't be able to lie his way out this time. Some truths don't shout. They wait in dust and silence, until the right hands are ready to open them. The key didn't fit easily at first. Years of rust had stiffened the lock on Dad's storage unit. I stood there for nearly 5 minutes, hands numb from the cold, coat collar pulled high against the wind. The parking lot was deserted. A single motion sensor light buzzed overhead, blinking erratically. When the bolt finally turned, it clicked with a reluctant snap, like something giving way that never wanted to. Unit 214 smelled of old metal and forgotten memories. I stepped inside slowly. Everything was just as I remembered from childhood, the smell of motor oil, the faint trace of pine from an old air freshener. Shelving units lined the back wall, filled with labeled bins. Most were mundane. Tools. Spare wires. Cans of paint in colors I didn't recognize. But on the far shelf, tucked behind a heavy canvas tarp, was a fireproof lockbox. I recognized it instantly. Dad's handwriting was scrawled across a masking tape label, personal. The lockbox wasn't large, just heavy. I carried it to the small folding table in the corner and brushed off the lid with my sleeve. The combination was a series of numbers I'd known my whole life, my birthday, reversed. It opened on the second try. Inside were folders. Dozens. Some marked with years, others simply labeled with short notes like insurance, mortgage, or trust correspondence. And at the very bottom, inside a sealed envelope marked in case of dispute, was what I didn't even realize I was hoping for. A video. Dad's old GoPro, cheap, scratched, but intact, wrapped in cloth alongside a printed transcript. I stared at it for a long time, the weight of what it meant anchoring me to the floor. He knew. He hadn't just suspected conflict, he had anticipated it. Prepared for it. I didn't watch the video right away. I couldn't. Not in that dim, musty unit with dust falling in rays through the broken light. Instead, I packed everything carefully and drove home. The apartment felt different when I walked in. Smaller, somehow. Not because of the physical space, but because the illusion that had held my family together, of shared truth, shared grief, was now visibly cracked. I changed into clean clothes, made tea I barely touched, and finally sat down in the quiet of my living room. Just me and my laptop. I connected the GoPro and waited as the file loaded. The footage began with static, then adjusted to show Dad sitting at his desk. His expression was gaunt, skin pale beneath a halo of late afternoon sun. But his eyes were clear. Direct. He said, "If you're watching this, then the will has been contested." I didn't breathe. He said, "Lauren, I assume this is you. If it's not, then something's gone very wrong." He looked off-screen briefly, then back. He said, "I changed the will to protect the legacy of what I built. Not just the money. The values. The history. You've always understood that. Jacob never has." My hands trembled slightly. He spoke for just under 4 minutes. No drama. No emotion. Just facts. The date he signed the final draft. The attorney present. The exact wording of his intentions. Even the reasoning, down to the financial records Jacob had borrowed without permission and the failed investments Dad quietly covered over the years. The video ended with a simple sentence. He said, "If this disappears, it's because someone made sure of it. Don't let them rewrite what's true." I saved 3 copies immediately. 1 to the cloud. 1 to a backup drive. 1 to an encrypted folder I'd set up that morning, anticipating something, but not this. With the video, I now had what Jacob couldn't refute. Not just evidence. Not just suspicion. But the voice of the man he'd tried to erase. Still, I didn't act immediately. I waited. Because power isn't just what you hold, it's when and how you use it. Instead, I began to build my case methodically. I reached out to a probate lawyer, independent of Penrose. A woman named Alana Kim, recommended by Grace's firm. She met me for coffee after hours, a quiet booth in a near-empty cafe near the courthouse. I didn't show her the video immediately. First, I laid out the documents. The draft will. The handwriting samples. The notary discrepancy. The copy of the forged version with metadata inconsistencies Grace had flagged. She studied everything without speaking for nearly 20 minutes. She said, "If you're telling the truth, you're sitting on a case. A serious one." I looked at her. I replied, "I don't want to ruin anyone. I just want what's right." She nodded. She said, "Sometimes, that's the same thing." We arranged next steps. Filing a formal challenge. Petitioning the court to freeze the estate's assets until review. The paperwork would take days, maybe weeks. Jacob wouldn't see it coming. And that's what I needed. Because in those weeks, the public perception would shift. I started slow, 1 or 2 quiet conversations. A shared coffee with Aunt Marla, casually dropping a reference to the forged signature. A neighbor who asked about the funeral and walked away startled after hearing how the will had changed suddenly. Word spread faster than I expected. Not as gossip, but as concern. By the time the petition was filed, I wasn't just the daughter making trouble. I was the one asking questions others had started to wonder themselves. Mom called again. This time, she sounded tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Just hollow. She said, "What are you trying to do, Lauren?" I paused. I replied, "Stop pretending." She didn't answer right away. She said, "You think your father was perfect?" I said, "No. But he was honest. And I won't let that die with him." She hung up. The silence afterward wasn't empty. It was peaceful. I knew now there was no return. No way to go back to what we were. The kind of betrayal Jacob committed wasn't a lapse, it was a strategy. And Mom. She had made her choice long ago. Loyalty through omission. That night, I stood at the window watching the streetlights flicker to life. Somewhere, just past the horizon of all this, was something cleaner. Not revenge. But restoration. The phone buzzed near midnight. It was Grace. Just one sentence. "You should open the transcript again. There's something else." I did. And buried in the margins, barely visible unless zoomed to 300%, was a note in Dad's handwriting I hadn't seen before. "Lauren, if they find this before you do, go to locker 308. You'll understand." Locker 308. Not the storage unit. Something else. Somewhere I hadn't looked. And now. I needed to find it. Sometimes, you walk into a room already knowing what the outcome will be. The trick is making everyone else believe they still have control. Locker 308 was at the downtown branch of Eastern Trust, a place I hadn't visited in years. The kind of bank with marble floors and security guards who smile too much. My father had opened the safe deposit box during a brief stretch of years when he was building everything, his business, his reputation, his future, and didn't trust anyone yet, not even the system he'd later become a part of. I remembered walking past the vault with him once as a teenager, carrying a manila envelope he wouldn't let me touch. I asked him what was in the box. He said, "What matters?" I hadn't understood then. I do now. The access process was slow. ID check, signature match, retinal scan. They still had him on file. The clerk hesitated when she saw the date of death next to his name in the system, but I handed her the legal authorization I'd filed weeks ago with the estate petition. She scanned it twice, looked me in the eye, and led me to the vault. When she placed the narrow metal box on the table and left me alone, the silence felt almost ceremonial. Inside was a leather-bound journal. And beneath it, a sealed envelope with my name in his unmistakable writing. No title. No instructions. Just, Lauren. The journal was heavier than I expected. A collection of handwritten entries, lists, notes. Receipts, even. Not financial ones, but emotional. Dates of arguments with Jacob. Times Mom had borrowed money and forgotten to return it. His thoughts after doctor appointments. His fears about what would happen if he died before putting everything in order. And then, halfway through, clipped inside the pages, was a handwritten amendment. Signed. Dated. Witnessed by Penrose's former assistant, someone I knew had since left the practice but was still legally listed as a notarial witness. The document outlined a final adjustment, reaffirming me as sole beneficiary and expressing explicit concern that any revisions made after March 15 should be treated with suspicion and thoroughly verified. The official will wasn't forged. It was swapped. Dad had updated a final version, and someone, Jacob, or Mom, or both, had intercepted it and submitted a different draft. Identical formatting. New signatures. A silent rewrite of my father's last decision. I placed everything carefully back in the envelope and walked out of the vault with one hand in my coat pocket, steadying my breath. Because now, I had more than just proof. I had leverage. The probate hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. But I didn't wait for the court. Instead, I called Jacob. He answered on the second ring. His voice was light, almost amused. He said, "Didn't expect to hear from you. Changed your mind about dragging us through the mud?" I replied, "I found the box." There was a pause. He said, "What box?" I said, "Locker 308. His breath caught. Just barely. But I heard it. I added, "We should talk. In person." He agreed to meet the next day. Neutral ground, the conference room of Alana Kim's office, by her request. Clean lines, glass walls, no distractions. Everything documented. Recorded. Controlled. I arrived early. Alana sat across from me, reviewing the new documents without expression. She didn't offer encouragement. Just nodded once, short and sharp. She said, "Let him talk first." Jacob entered with a calmness that looked practiced. He wore a navy blazer I recognized from Dad's closet, tailored now to fit him better than it ever fit our father. He smiled when he sat down. Not at me. At the room. At the idea of being in charge. He said, "So. Let's stop pretending. You're not going to win. The court won't overturn a valid, signed will. Especially not with your reputation." Alana leaned forward slightly, tapping her pen on the table. She said, "We're not here to argue that." He said, "Then what are we doing?" I opened the envelope and slid the amended codicil across the table. Then the journal. Then the witness affidavit, newly signed by Penrose's former assistant, confirming the date she saw my father sign the document. Jacob didn't touch them. Just stared. I said, "I'm not taking this to court. Not yet. I'm giving you a choice." He said nothing. I continued, "Step down. Relinquish your claim. Publicly. Acknowledge the error. You can keep your dignity. Or I can let the judge decide what to call this." He stared at the paper like it might explode. Alana broke the silence. She said, "Forgery. Fraud. Interference with a legal document. Up to 5 years if proven intentional." His jaw flexed. He said, "This is still a family matter." I replied, "Not anymore." We sat in silence. The kind that comes after someone realizes their story won't be believed anymore. Not even by themselves. He stood. Not angrily. Just slowly. He said, I'll need time. I said, you have until Monday. He walked out without another word. And I sat there, listening to the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. I didn't feel victorious. Just still. Like the wind had stopped for the first time in weeks. Alana turned to me and raised one eyebrow. She said, he's going to come back with an offer. I nodded. Because now, he had nothing else to bargain with but the truth. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Jacob. Subject line, let's settle this quietly. No body text. Just an attachment. A scan of a signed statement, relinquishing his claim. And a request. To meet, one last time. Just the two of us. He says he wants to explain. Says there are things I don't understand. I don't know if I believe him. But I said yes. Even when the storm passes, the damage doesn't disappear. It settles quietly into the foundation, waiting to be acknowledged. I met Jacob at the old train station cafe on the edge of town. The one with chipped mugs and booths that creak when you sit down. It was empty except for us and the barista, who looked too tired to care who we were or what we were doing. The heater clicked unevenly in the corner, humming like something barely holding itself together. He was already there when I arrived. No suit. No mask. Just a wool sweater I hadn't seen in years and hands that wouldn't quite stay still. He didn't smile. Neither did I. I sat across from him, waited for the silence to thicken, then nodded once. I said, you wanted to talk. He studied me like I was a puzzle he no longer knew how to solve. He said, you won. I said, it wasn't a game. He looked away. For a long time, neither of us said anything else. Then, softly, he reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table. A small photo, faded, wrinkled at the edges. The three of us. Me, him, and Dad. Standing in front of the house with plastic cups of lemonade, barefoot on the gravel. I couldn't have been more than 10. I remembered that day. Barely. I remembered the way the sun caught in Dad's hair and how Mom had stayed inside, folding towels for company that never came. He said, I didn't start out trying to take anything from you. I looked at the photo, not at him. He said, at first, I thought he just made a mistake. That he forgot. I thought I'd correct it before it became permanent. I didn't move. He said, but when I read what he left for you, what he wrote, I saw what I never had. The words didn't land with bitterness. Just recognition. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't want one. What I wanted was the truth, however late it came. I replied, you were his son. He flinched slightly, but I kept going. I said, and he loved you, even when he stopped trusting you. Even when you gave him reasons not to. He nodded slowly. His eyes looked older than they had just weeks ago. As if the fight had aged him in ways he didn't expect. He said, she helped me. I didn't need to ask who. Mom's silence had always been its own kind of instruction. He said, she said it wasn't fair. That you were just like him. That you'd cut us out. That you'd win. I exhaled. I replied, I didn't want to win. I just wanted what was real. He looked at me then. Fully. Not with anger or rivalry, but with something that hovered between shame and clarity. He said, I signed the papers. I nodded. We sat for another 20 minutes. Talking about the estate. The hearing. The lawyers. It was business now, cold and procedural, stripped of all the heat it had carried before. He asked if he could keep the gold watch. I said yes. Not because he deserved it, but because it would never mean to him what it meant to me. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. He said, you know he always believed in you, right? I paused. I replied, eventually, I believed in myself. Outside, the sky was bruised with late winter clouds. The air carried that damp heaviness that comes just before the thaw. By the end of that week, the estate was settled. Quietly. Without fanfare. Jacob submitted the statement formally to the court, forfeiting any challenge. Alana filed a motion to dismiss the dispute hearing. The judge approved the transfer of all assets in accordance with the original, validated will. Dad's business holdings passed to me. His accounts. His remaining property. And the house. The house was still full of ghosts. I hadn't stepped inside again since the day Mom confronted me in the hallway. But the deed was now in my name. Official. Final. I didn't change the locks. I didn't throw anything out. Instead, I spent a slow afternoon walking through each room with a notepad, cataloging what needed repairs. Which pieces of furniture I'd keep. Which I'd donate. Which I'd store until I could decide. Upstairs, in the study, I found a folded scrap of paper tucked into the back of a drawer. A note in Dad's handwriting. If you're reading this, I hope it means you didn't give up. I sat down in the old chair, the one he used to nap in after dinner, and stared at the paper until my eyes blurred. There was no anger left. No triumph. Just a quiet sense of gravity. This had cost me something. Not just time or peace, but trust. Trust in people I'd grown up believing were part of me. Trust in the kind of family we all pretend we have, even when we know better. The next week, I filed to have Dad's company assets transferred to a holding trust under my name. Alana helped me set up protections to ensure that the business would continue, honestly, sustainably. I hired new auditors. I replaced the old accountant who once signed off on suspicious ledgers under Jacob's instruction. I didn't announce it to the family. I just did it. Mom didn't call again. Not after the court decision. Not after Jacob signed. Not after the house transferred. She disappeared into the same silence she'd used as shelter for decades. I don't know if she feels guilt. Or just relief that it's over. Part of me still waits for her voice, even when I know it won't come. Instead, I started writing my own. One entry at a time. In the back pages of Dad's journal, where he'd left blank sheets and a small paperclip that held nothing at all. At the end of the month, I returned the key to Jacob's lawyer. The one for the storage unit. With a note that said simply, "There's nothing left to hide." And I meant it. Or I thought I did. Until a letter arrived. No return address. No postmark. Just my name. And a single sentence inside. You don't know the whole story yet. Sometimes, the truth arrives long after you stop needing it. And still, somehow, it changes everything. The envelope had no return address. The handwriting was uneven, unfamiliar, like someone had forced the pen to obey. It wasn't typed. It wasn't polished. Just 7 words in blue ink on a playing card. You don't know the whole story yet. I didn't recognize the handwriting. It wasn't Jacob's. Wasn't Dad's. Wasn't Mom's. At first, I thought it might be a mistake. Or a leftover seed of manipulation. A final mind game, dropped in the mail to stir up what had finally gone still. I set it on the table and stared at it for hours. And then I put it away. I didn't investigate. I didn't trace the ink or search the postal route or call Grace to run forensic tests. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't need to know more. Not to move forward. Not to heal. What mattered had already revealed itself, not through someone else's version of events, but through mine. Through the choices I made when no one was watching. The restraint I held when rage would have been easy. The quiet refusal to become like the people who hurt me. The truth wasn't what saved me. Integrity did. The house took 3 months to renovate. Not structurally, emotionally. I peeled back layers of wallpaper my mother had chosen, uncovering patterns from the years before I was born. I found a child's scribbles on the back of a closet wall, my own, probably, marked in crayon and hidden behind a rack of coats. I left them there. A reminder that not all things broken need to be erased. I kept the study mostly intact. Dad's chair. His old desk. I replaced the blinds, added a new lamp, but left his handwriting on the shelves where he'd labeled the files. His voice still lived there. I didn't turn it into an office. I turned it into a place to write. Not for legal records or ledgers or anything that demanded proof. Just stories. Memories. Letters I'd never send. I wrote one to Jacob. Not to forgive him, but to let the weight settle in words. I never mailed it. He hasn't contacted me since that final conversation. I hear things, sometimes, third-hand mentions from people in town, whispers about how he stepped back from everything, how he's been quiet lately. Let him be. Mom still hasn't called. I sent her one letter. Short. Respectful. I wrote, I hope you're well. I hope you found peace. No reply. But I don't feel hollow about it anymore. Some connections fade without closure. Others survive only in absence. That's its own kind of answer. I walk most mornings now. Early, before the sun finishes rising. I take the long road past the pecan groves we used to bike through as kids. The trees haven't changed. Still leaning into the wind, stubborn and patient. Still bearing fruit only when they're ready. There's something deeply comforting in that. Time doesn't erase damage. But it does soften the edges. One evening, while sorting boxes in the attic, I found something I hadn't remembered packing, a cassette tape. Labeled in Dad's handwriting, for later. I borrowed a neighbor's tape player and sat alone at the kitchen table as the static gave way to his voice. He said, if you're hearing this, you've made it through more than I probably ever understood. I didn't always say the right things, or notice what I should have. But I saw you, Lauren. You were never invisible. Not to me. His voice cracked slightly before the tape clicked off. That was it. 53 seconds. I didn't cry. I just sat there, hand resting on the counter, and let the quiet wrap around me like a blanket I hadn't realized I needed. Grief is strange like that. It doesn't always come in sobs. Sometimes it comes in the simple act of listening without needing more. This house, this life, it's mine now. Not as inheritance. As responsibility. As a choice. I've begun offering small grants through Dad's business accounts. Quietly. No publicity. Just quiet help to women rebuilding after loss. No strings. Just a soft place to land. Because I know what it means to lose everything that made sense. And to build anyway. I've repainted the front door. Replanted the garden. Donated the last of the clothes that didn't belong to this new chapter. And every so often, when the wind cuts just right, I swear I hear Dad's footsteps in the hall. Not as a haunting. As a memory that no longer hurts. Jacob's silence hasn't lifted. Maybe it never will. But if he's out there, trying, somewhere, I hope he learns what I did. That taking something doesn't make it yours. And that truth always waits. Even if it arrives late. Even if it arrives in the quiet. Even if it arrives as nothing more than the echo of your own name spoken by someone who, finally, knew who you were. And if someone ever asks me how it ended, how I found peace after everything, I'll tell them the truth. It didn't end. It became mine.